We're in the middle of chapter 21 of Matthew, and there's a story here about a fig tree. Jesus had gone for rest, and on the way back into the city the next day, he became hungry, and he walked by this fig tree, and there are no figs on it. He says, "No longer shall there ever be any fruit from you." And at once the fig tree withered. And the disciples, seeing a marvel, said, "How did this fig tree wither at once?" And Jesus basically gave them, it was his lesson on faith. He says, if you do not doubt, if you have faith and do not doubt, you should not only say that this be done to the fig tree, but if you say to the mountain, be taken and cast in the sea, all things you ask in prayer, believing, you shall receive. So here's this thing that Jesus is talking about, this incredible faith. Once again, it's when there's total reliance upon the Lord. And they were amazed. Some people have made this out to say, well, he was cursing the fig tree. It's Israel, and there's no longer going to be any fruit from you. There could be some degree of truth or application to that, but as we read in the scriptures, we also read when we get to the book of Romans that Paul says that there's going to be a restoration when the Jews, the Israelites, come back to faith in God. It says it'll be like life from the dead. And, so it might be, yeah, they're dead, but God really, his perfection or his greatest, one of his greatest joys, his glory, is raising things from the dead. And so here, even if it is Israel was caused to be cursed and die, I believe a resurrection is coming because we can see that in other places in the scriptures. Well, the chief priests and the elders came to him in verse 23, and they wanted to know by what authority are you doing this? Now, the chief priests at the time, they were Sadducees, I think, at that time, and they were saying, what authority do you have to be doing these things? And Jesus didn't answer directly. This is one of the classic answer that he gave, and it was in the form of another question. And he said, Jesus answered them in verse 24, I will ask you one thing too, which if you tell me, I'll also tell you by what authority I do these things. The baptism of John was from what source? From heaven or from men? And that put these guys in a real tough place, because these leaders had basically not responded to John the Baptist, but the people saw him as a prophet. So they couldn't answer this question. They couldn't say, well, his authority is from heaven. Then it would be, well, why didn't you respond? It said his authority is from men. It said, well, the people thought he was a prophet, and they'd liable to riot against him. So in Jesus asking this, they said, we do not know. That's all they could say. So what a great question. Then Jesus said, well, then I'm not going to tell you what authority I'm doing it. Classic. And then he tells a little parable about two sons. One, they're both asked to go out work in the field. One says, no, I'm not going to do it. And the other says, yeah, I'll do it. And the one says he's not going to do it, actually goes out and does it. And the one that says, I will do it, doesn't do it. And then he just says, who really did the will of the Father? And it's the one who actually, even though he said, no, I won't, he went and do it. And he uses that to give an illustration. He says, truly I say to you that tax gatherers and harlots will get into the kingdom of God before you. Ooh, talking about these chief priests and all these guys that, they've given their lives to do the will of God, but he's basically saying, you're not doing it. You said you would do it, but you're not going to do it. And here the tax gatherers, harlots, and all of those weren't going to do the will of God, but they end up doing it. He says they'll get into the kingdom of heaven before you. And so what powerful, poignant, statements Jesus makes. And he doesn't worry about offending someone, because he wants to tell the truth. Because the truth is the only thing that's going to cause us to turn our hearts and turn to him. So there's a rebuke at the end of this chapter from like verses 33 to 46. Basically, he uses a parable, and he goes back to the Old Testament again. He goes back to Isaiah, and he quotes about a landowner that gave the people everything they needed, dug around and made it everything, and it didn't produce any fruit, this vineyard. And then he quotes out of the Psalms, says, did you never read in the scriptures, the stone which the builders rejected, this became the chief cornerstone. This came about from the Lord, and it is marvelous in our eyes. He's talking about the stone which the builders rejected. The builders would be those leaders in Israel. And it says, but they're going to reject the cornerstone, the stone that God is going to use to build his church upon. And, it's amazing. The quote that he quotes out of here, out of Psalm 118, actually the last part of that says, this is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. And what day is that? It's the day that the builders rejected the stone, but God took that stone and made it the chief cornerstone. This is the day that the Lord has made. He's made that day of rejoicing when Jesus has been exalted as the chief cornerstone of the whole church, of what we call the body of Christ. So he's the cornerstone, but he's the head. He's the capstone. He's the head of the body. He's the foundation of everything. He's both the in the beginning and the end. There's those statements there that show that he's basically, he makes it all up and we just kind of fit in there. And in verse 45 kind of ends this rebuke that he has. He says, when the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, they understood that he was speaking about them. Okay, they got this. They really understood. He's talking about they're the ones that rejected the stone. They're the ones that didn't do anything with the vineyard that was made for them and left for them in perfect shape, but they couldn't fulfill God's purpose for it. It says, and when they sought to seize him, they feared the multitude because they held him to be a prophet. So once again, we see that the leaders of the Jews at this point, and this is, like I said, I don't know if all of this is right within that last week, but it was introduced as that last week when he came in riding on the donkey. And so I don't know if, because Matthew didn't say that he's going to put everything in consecutive order. Luke, when he writes his gospel, says, I'm putting this in consecutive order. So I'm not sure if some of these teachings came before this or if they really were all in that last week, but we see this really a lot of power-packed information thrown into this last little bit, and Jesus begins to rebuke those that are really opposing him. And so we move into chapter 22, and it starts out with a parable of the wedding feast, and that's a good one for you. I'm not going to go through all of that. I'm not going to look at that this time. Nothing is worth skipping, but then the Sadducees and Pharisees, the Pharisees come up to him in verse 15 and went up and counseled together how they might trap him in what he said. So here they're trying to set a trap. They're really pushing hard at this point to get some accusations against Jesus that are worthy of death. Now they think they got some, but they're going to come up with some false witnesses and that kind of thing. But here they're coming up with a way they want to know something that they can hold against him. And so this is about taxes. They figure if they can get him saying stuff against Caesar, that would get all the government officials on their side to get this Jesus crucified. So they ask him, teacher, we know that you are truthful, verse 16, and teach the way of God in truth and defer to no one. That's buttering up, The Proverbs say flattery sets a net for your feet. If you just listen to this flattering stuff, you just kind of let into it. Well, they're trying to flatter him with the beginning. You defer to no one, for you are not partial to any. Tell us, therefore, what do you think? Is it lawful to give a poll tax to Caesar or not? So they're really, they butter him up, and then they're trying to trip him up. And they tell him, is it right to give a tax to Caesar? And he, once again, incredible answers. He says, you have a coin? Show me your coin. He says, whose inscription is on the coin? And they said, Caesar. And then he says, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar, and give to God the things that are God. What sign is on our lives? What's the imprint on our life? What's the inscription on a human life? Well, we're in the image of God. Well, give to God the things that are God. Give to Caesar the things that are Caesar. Coins? Yeah, give them to Caesar. They got his inscription on them. So on that day, it says in verse 23, the Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection, came to him and questioned him. So they don't think there's a resurrection. So they're questioning about this thing. There's these seven brothers. The first one has a wife. He dies. All the six of them, each one dies, and all six of them have him as a wife. And they say, well, in the resurrection, whose wife will she be? They're trying to stump him with this question. And he says, verse 29, you are mistaken, not understanding the scriptures or the power of God. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. But regarding the resurrection of the dead, have you not read that what was spoken to you by God, saying, I am the God of Abraham and a God of Isaac and the God of Jacob? He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. And when the multitudes heard this, they were astonished at his teaching. Once again, he just blows them away with this answer. And he says, he gives a statement that they use on a regular basis, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, he's not the God of the dead. He's the God of the living. And so that's where he answers the whole thing on the Sadducees' idea that there is no resurrection.